The first warning wasn't the flashing lights in the sky or the sudden, choking silence that fell over the town of Marrow Creek. It was the dogs. They howled and clawed at doors, their instincts kicking long before anyone else sensed it. Kade Kramer was standing on the rusted porch of his workshop, a battered mug of coffee in his hand, watching the horizon darken in broad daylight. He frowned, set the mug down, and grabbed the old rifle that leaned against the doorframe more out of habit than expectation. As the first of the Shalzek dropships broke through the clouds, it was already too late for a warning. The ground quaked as the heavy metallic pods slammed into the fields beyond town. Dust blew up in choking clouds. Kade watched, heart hammering, as the sides of the pods peeled open and creatures poured out tall, armored beings with segmented skin that looked like woven steel, each carrying weapons that pulsed with a sickly green energy. Kade didn't run. He backed inside his workshop, locked the door, and slipped the rifle's bolt into place. The radio crackled on the bench beside him. "This is Sheriff Duncan. All residents stay inside your homes. Repeat, stay inside." A loud crash echoed down the street. Kade moved to the window. He saw a group of the Shalzek soldiers tear the roof off the diner like it was made of cardboard. Screams followed. He gritted his teeth, pulled a battered duffel from under the counter, and slung it over his shoulder. Inside were supplies he had packed long ago, back when he used to think about disasters, hurricanes, riots, maybe a bad winter storm. He had never imagined this. The door rattled as something slammed against it. "Open," an alien barked, voice garbled but understandable. Kade stayed silent. He backed toward the rear exit, but before he reached it, the front door exploded inward. Splinters flew, and Kade was thrown back against a shelf. His shoulder screamed in protest. A Shalzek stormed inside, weapon raised. Kade scrambled behind the counter, heart pounding. "You are weak," the alien growled, stepping closer. "Submit." Kade glanced at the old hunting knife stuck into the counter's side. He grabbed it, waited until the Shalzek rounded the corner, then lunged. The blade slid between the armor plates at the creature's side. It shrieked, staggering back. Kade didn't wait. He bolted through the rear door, sprinting into the alley behind his shop. Shots hissed past him, melting holes in the brick walls. He ducked into another, building the hardware store, and slammed the door shut behind him. Kade leaned against the door, gasping. His shoulder throbbed, and he knew from the way it hung that it was probably dislocated. "Not the worst I've had," he muttered to himself. The radio on his belt crackled again. "This is Duncan. They're rounding people up at the high school gym. Don't let them take you." Kade's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to end up penned like cattle. He moved carefully through the store, grabbing a crowbar and stuffing nails, wire, and a hammer into his duffel. His mind raced. He needed a plan. The Shalzek soldiers outside barked orders to each other. Kade peeked through a broken window. He counted at least 20 of them, moving through town with mechanical efficiency. He needed to get to the woods. If he could reach the tree line 2 miles east, he might have a chance to circle back and help others. Kade slipped out of the hardware store's back door and crept through the alleys. Smoke drifted from the wrecked diner. A battered pickup truck sat abandoned nearby, keys still in the ignition. He glanced around. No aliens in sight. He ran for it, wrenched the door open, and threw himself inside. The truck rumbled to life with a cough. Immediately, shouts erupted behind him. Green bolts of energy seared past as he gunned the engine and tore down the street, tires screaming. A Shalzek fired a shot that hit the rear tire. The truck fishtailed wildly. Kade fought for control, heart hammering, and managed to right it just in time to crash through the town's eastern fence. The fields stretched out before him, golden and open. Beyond them, the woods. He pressed the pedal to the floor. The truck made it another half-mile before the ruined tire shredded completely. Kade was thrown against the steering wheel as the vehicle slammed into a ditch. Groaning, he crawled out, slinging his duffel over his good shoulder. He could hear the alien's pursuit behind him. He limped across the field, every step jarring his injured shoulder. The woods seemed impossibly far away. A shadow passed overhead. Kade looked up to see a small Shalzek scout drone swooping toward him. "Come on," he muttered. The drone fired. Kade dove, landing hard on his side, pain flaring bright and sharp. He rolled to his feet and hurled the crowbar with all the strength he had left. It struck the drone's intake vent. Sparks flew and the machine spiraled into the dirt. Kade didn't stop to celebrate. He kept moving, half running, half stumbling. Minutes later, he reached the tree line. The cool shade closed around him like a shield. He ducked into the undergrowth, gasping for air. His shoulder was a fiery knot of agony. He needed to do something about it if he was going to survive. Gritting his teeth, he found a sturdy branch, wedged it between two rocks, and braced his arm against it. "This is gonna suck," he said aloud. He pulled sharply. The pain was blinding. He collapsed to his knees, cursing through gritted teeth. When the world stopped spinning, he tested the arm carefully. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. He tore a strip from his shirt and rigged a sling. Movement caught his eye. A Shalzek soldier was picking its way through the trees, weapon scanning. Kade pressed himself into the underbrush. He realized then that the Shalzek weren't just here to conquer. They were here to break spirits. That wasn't going to happen. Kade waited until the alien passed, then moved deeper into the woods. By nightfall, he had found a small, hidden hollow. He built a fire with shaking hands, using flint from his pack. He boiled water from a nearby stream and cleaned his wound as best he could. He didn't sleep much. Every snap of a twig sent him reaching for his knife. At dawn, he headed back toward town, sticking to the trees. He found survivors holed up in an abandoned barn. Among them was Sheriff Duncan, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "Kade," Duncan croaked when he saw him. "Thought you were dead." "Not yet," Kade said. The sheriff's wife, Martha, handed Kade a scrap of paper. It was a rough map of the town with alien patrols marked. "They're taking everyone to the gym," Duncan said. "We have to stop them." Kade studied the map. "We need to hit their supply lines, cut their communications. If they can't coordinate, they'll panic." Martha hesitated. "They're not like us. They don't panic." Kade gave a grim smile. "Everyone panics when enough goes wrong." He spent the next 2 days gathering supplies, scouting patrols, setting traps. Every move was slow, painful. His shoulder ached constantly, and he knew he was pushing it too hard, but he had no choice. The first trap was simple, a tripwire strung across a narrow alley. When a Shalzek patrol hit it, a stack of heavy crates fell from a second-story window. The second trap involved a stolen Shalzek communicator rigged to emit false distress signals. It drew half their forces into a wild goose chase. Each small victory cost Kade dearly. He twisted his ankle during a nighttime raid and had to limp back to the barn, blood soaking through his makeshift sling. But he didn't stop. Word spread among the survivors. Kade Kramer wasn't giving up. He was fighting back. Others joined him: farmers, store clerks, teenagers barely old enough to drive. They weren't soldiers, but they had something the Shalzek didn't understand. They had grit, and grit could be lethal. The barn smelled of damp straw and diesel fumes, a smell Kade barely noticed anymore. He sat cross-legged against a sagging wall, clenching a thin strip of leather between his teeth as Martha tightened the splint around his swollen ankle. His face was pale under the grime. "You're lucky it's just a bad sprain," she muttered, wrapping the cloth tighter. "Could have been worse." Kade grunted, biting down harder when she secured the final knot. "Feels like worse." "You don't have to keep running around," she said without looking up. "Others can handle it now." "Not an option," he said once the leather strip fell from his mouth. "We've barely slowed them down." From the other end of the barn, Duncan limped over, clutching a battered shotgun. His face was set, but there was a fatigue around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "They're bringing in reinforcements," he said without preamble. "Saw a fresh batch of those metal skin freaks marching down Main Street this morning. Bigger ones." Kade pressed his good hand against the floor, forcing himself upright. The room tilted, but he stayed on his feet. "Then we hit harder," Kade said. "Make them think we're more than we are." Martha stood too, wiping her hands on her jeans. "We're running low on supplies. Ammo, food, clean water. People are scared." "Fear cuts both ways," Kade said, limping toward the workbench they turned into a planning table. "If we can scare them worse, we win time." Duncan gave a dry chuckle that sounded more like a cough. "Easier said than done." Kade spread out the map again. Someone had added crude drawings where new alien camps had sprung up. They were closing in, squeezing the town like a fist. "We can't beat them head-on, but we can break their toys." Martha leaned over the map. You're thinking sabotage, exactly. Hit their food stores, weapon depots, anything that makes life easy for them. Make them waste energy hunting ghosts. A low rumble shook the barn walls. Dust drifted from the rafters. The three of them froze, listening. They're getting closer, Duncan said quietly. Kade tapped a spot on the map with his finger. There's an old maintenance tunnel under the power station. Leads right into their main camp, Martha frowned. It's probably swarming with them. Probably, Kade agreed. Still our best shot. Duncan folded his arms. You're not going alone. Kade didn't argue. He knew better than to waste time. 2 hours later, after a cold meal of canned beans and stale crackers, Kade and Duncan slipped out under the cover of dusk. Martha stayed behind to rally the others and keep watch. The fields were eerily silent. Broken tractors and scorched crops stretched in every direction, relics of a life that had crumbled overnight. They stayed low, moving from cover to cover, Kade's ankles screaming in protest with every step. Sweat stung his eyes, but he clenched his jaw and pushed through. By the time they reached the power station, the sky had deepened into a bruised purple. The chain-link fence around the building had been torn down, replaced by jagged metal spikes hammered into the ground. Alien guards paced the perimeter, their armor catching the moonlight. Duncan pointed to a drainage grate half buried in rubble. That's the tunnel, Kade nodded, pulling a crowbar from his belt. He jammed it into the edges of the grate, levering it upward with a grunt. It gave with a sharp crack, and he slid it aside as quietly as possible. A rank, metallic smell wafted up from the dark hole. You first, Duncan said grimly. Kade lowered himself in, boots scraping against the damp concrete. The tunnel was barely wide enough to crawl through, and the air was thick and stale. They moved slowly, flashlights off, guided only by the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through cracks above. After what felt like an eternity, Kade spotted a rusted ladder leading up. He gestured to Duncan, and together they climbed, emerging into a shadowy storage room stacked with crates covered in alien symbols. Kade crouched, listening. No footsteps, no voices. He pried open one of the crates. Inside were rows of shimmering orbs pulsing faintly. Ammo, Duncan whispered. Kade's mouth twisted into a grim smile. He rifled through his pack, pulling out a bundle of homemade explosives fashioned from fertilizer, diesel, and every scrap of wire they'd been able to scrounge. He set the charges carefully, wiring them together with deliberate movements. His fingers were clumsy, slick with sweat, but he didn't rush. Once I light this, he said, we've got maybe 2 minutes tops. Duncan nodded, tightening his grip on the shotgun. Ready. Kade struck a match, the tiny flame flaring in the darkness. He touched it to the fuse. It hissed to life, spitting sparks. They bolted. The return through the tunnel was a blur of pain and adrenaline. Kade's ankle buckled twice, but he forced himself up each time, inhaling the rancid air in shallow gasps. They burst from the drainage hole into the open field just as the world behind them erupted into a fiery bloom. The shockwave slammed both men to the ground. Kade's ears rang, and hot debris rained down like a summer hailstorm. From the woods beyond the field, Martha waved frantically. Kade staggered up, dragging Duncan with him, and they half ran, half stumbled toward cover. By the time they reached the tree line, alien shrieks filled the night, sharp and furious. Martha grabbed Kade's arm, hauling him deeper into the woods. You did it, she gasped. They're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Kade allowed himself a tight nod, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. It's a start. They regrouped at the barn just before dawn. Survivors filtered in slowly, wide-eyed and whispering about the explosion. Kade leaned against a battered hay bale, breathing hard. Martha pressed a cup of water into his hand. You need real help, she said, glancing at his swollen ankle and the angry bruise blossoming along his ribs. No doctors left, Kade rasped. Just keep it clean. She crouched beside him, unwrapping the makeshift sling. His shoulder was a mess of purple and yellow, the joint swollen grotesquely. This is bad, she said bluntly. Yeah, Kade said, sucking in a breath as she probed the joint gently. Not gonna get better sitting around. You're not a machine, you know, Martha said, voice low. Kade's laugh was more a wheeze. Don't need to be, just need to be stubborn. She didn't argue, just pulled a battered first aid manual from her pack and flipped it open. The pages were smudged and torn, but the diagrams were still readable. Dislocated again, she muttered, more to herself than him. We need to reset it. Kade glanced at her, eyebrows raised. You sure? No, she admitted, but it's this or you lose the arm. He nodded once, sharp and sure. Martha wedged her foot against his ribs, gripped his arm firmly, and on the count of 3, yanked. Kade's scream ripped through the barn, raw and unfiltered. Several people flinched, but no one turned away. When it was over, he lay sprawled on the straw, gasping, sweat pouring off him. Martha wiped her forehead with her sleeve. It's back in. He gave a weak thumbs up. From the corner, Duncan cleared his throat. Hate to break up the bonding, but we've got a bigger problem. Kade struggled upright, blinking blearily. What now? Duncan tossed a crumpled piece of alien metal onto the ground. It was part of a comms device, still sparking faintly. They're calling reinforcements from orbit. Bigger ships, heavier troops. Kade stared at it, mind racing. How long? Maybe a day, maybe less. The barn fell silent, the weight of it settling over everyone like a second skin. Martha crossed her arms. We can't outrun them, we can't outgun them. But we can outthink them, Kade said slowly. He pushed himself to his feet, wobbling but upright. They expect a fight, he said. They expect desperation. What they won't expect is surrender. Martha's eyes narrowed. You're not serious, not real surrender, Kade said. A trap. Duncan shook his head. That's insane. Kade's mouth twisted in something close to a grin. Yeah, that's the point. He limped to the map again, dragging his fingers across the worn paper. We lure them into the gym. Pack it with every explosive we've got left. When they move in to collect the captives, we light them up. Martha stared at him, expression unreadable. And if they figure it out? Kade shrugged, grimacing with the motion. Then we die tired. The barn was silent except for the creak of the rafters. Finally, Duncan let out a long, slow breath. Crazy bastard. Kade grinned wider. You in? Duncan nodded. Martha gave a short, sharp laugh and threw up her hands. Fine. But if we survive this, I'm making you eat nothing but canned spinach for a year. Kade winked. Deal. They got to work. The gymnasium loomed in the misty morning like a concrete tomb. Kade leaned against the battered wall of the maintenance shed across the street, adjusting the frayed strap of the heavy duffel slung over his back. Martha crouched beside him, checking the last bundle of detonators, her hands steady even though the air around them buzzed with the low, constant hum of alien patrols. You sure this'll hold? She asked without looking up. Built it myself, Kade said. His voice rasped from exhaustion, but the corners of his mouth twitched in something close to grim satisfaction. Worst case, it'll make a hell of a mess. Duncan peered through a crack in the shed door, his knuckles white around the stock of a scavenged alien rifle. They're rounding up the last groups now, half hour, maybe less, before they haul everyone inside. Martha tied off the last wire and glanced at Kade. Once we're in, no way out. I know, Kade said. They didn't waste words after that. Each of them knew what they were signing up for. The plan was brutally simple. They'd let themselves be captured alongside the other prisoners, hide the detonators among the gym's wrecked bleachers and crumbling walls, and wait for the signal. When the Shalzek gathered to celebrate their victory, Kade would trigger the charges remotely with a makeshift transmitter he'd cobbled from an old radio and pieces of alien tech. They moved when the alien horn sounded a deep, vibrating blast that shook dust from the cracked pavement. Kade and Martha stumbled from the shed, raising their hands high, expressions blank. Duncan followed, feigning a limp. The Shalzek patrol spotted them immediately. 3 soldiers in gleaming armor jogged over, weapons raised. The leader barked something guttural, gesturing sharply with his weapon. Kade kept his gaze down, biting the inside of his cheek so hard he tasted blood. One wrong look, one twitch out of place, and they'd be cut down on the spot. The aliens shoved them into line with the others, maybe 24 townsfolk, most of them battered and hollow-eyed. No one spoke. No one dared. The march to the gym was short but brutal. If someone stumbled, they were jabbed with the butt of a weapon. Kade caught a glimpse of old Mr. Hargrove from the feed store, face swollen and bruised, his hands tied behind his back. Inside, the gym was a miserable wreck. The basketball hoops hung at odd angles, The bleachers were half collapsed, and a sour smell of mildew hung in the air. The Shalzek herded everyone to the center of the court, forcing them to kneel. Kade saw Martha slipping the first detonator under a broken bench as she crouched down. Duncan, wincing dramatically, let another device fall into a pile of debris. Kade's own detonator was tucked inside the lining of his jacket, the transmitter pressed against his ribs, hidden by layers of filthy fabric. The aliens barked more orders. One of them, larger than the others and wearing dark red armor, stomped forward. He scanned the prisoners with a sneer so palpable it transcended species. Kade kept his head bowed, heart hammering. The alien commander roared something unintelligible. A chorus of mechanical laughter answered him from his soldiers. Martha shifted slightly, her hand brushing against Kade's. Her fingers tapped once, twice, 3 times the prearranged signal. All charges planted, now they waited. The Shalzek dragged in a heavy generator, positioning it near the stage at the far end of the gym. The hum of the machine filled the space with a low, teeth-rattling vibration. Above them, strange banners unfurled from the rafters symbols Kade couldn't read, but the intention was clear enough. This was meant to be a declaration, a spectacle. Kade watched, breathing shallowly as more soldiers filed in. There were dozens now, maybe more, crowding the gym with their hulking forms and clanking armor. The commander raised his arms, shouting. Martha's knee pressed against Kade's, now. Kade shifted his weight subtly, pulling the transmitter from his jacket. He thumbed the battered switch. Nothing happened. Panic lanced through him. He pressed it again, harder, still nothing. Martha's eyes flicked to him, wide. Kade gritted his teeth, fighting the rising tide of dread. He flipped the casing open. A single wire had come loose, probably during the rough march. His fingers, stiff with cold and fear, worked the wire back into place. He twisted it around the terminal, ignoring the painful throb in his swollen knuckles. Above them, the Shalzek commander bellowed again. Soldiers began moving toward the prisoners, weapons raised. Kade jammed the switch down. The gym exploded in a roar of fire and splintering concrete. The blast wave lifted Kade off the ground and slammed him into the remains of the bleachers. His ears rang, and for a moment the world dissolved into a blur of heat and smoke. He forced himself up, coughing, vision swimming. The center of the gym was a blackened crater. Shalzek bodies sprawled everywhere, armor crumpled like paper. Fires licked up the walls, devouring banners and beams alike. Martha was dragging herself free from a pile of debris, her face streaked with soot but alive. Duncan stumbled toward them, one hand pressed to a bleeding gash on his scalp. Outside, chaos erupted. More alien troops, drawn by the explosion, rushed toward the gym. Kade staggered to his feet, grabbing Martha's arm. "We need to move," he rasped. She nodded grimly. Together, they hauled Duncan up and limped toward the gaping hole where the gym doors had been. Outside, the town was in uproar. Black smoke billowed into the sky. Shalzek soldiers shouted over each other, firing wildly into the streets, unsure of where the next attack would come from. Kade stumbled into the alley behind the gym, dragging Martha and Duncan with him. They didn't stop running until they reached the river that cut through the edge of town. The shallow water glittered under the smoke-gray sky. Kade collapsed onto the rocky shore, gasping. Martha crouched beside him, checking his injuries with quick, efficient movements. "Your ribs are bad," she said, wrapping a strip of cloth around his chest. "Could be broken. Feels like it," Kade muttered, wincing as she tightened the bandage. He coughed wetly, pain lancing through him. "We need to get you out of here," she said. "All of us." Duncan knelt awkwardly, holding his bleeding arm. "If we head upriver, there's the old ranger station. Supplies, maybe a working radio." Kade nodded, forcing himself upright. Every bone in his body ached, but he shoved the pain aside. They moved carefully along the riverbank, keeping low. The forest thickened around them, muffling the sounds of the burning town. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light through the smoke. By midday, they reached the ranger station, a squat building half hidden by overgrown pines. The windows were shattered and the door hung loose on its hinges, but there was no sign of Shalzek patrols. Inside, the station was musty but intact. Kade collapsed onto an old sofa while Martha rummaged through the cabinets, finding bandages, bottled water, and a battered first aid kit. Duncan found the radio, miraculously still functional, and began fiddling with the dials. Kade leaned his head back, closing his eyes. His ribs screamed with every breath, his ankle throbbed, and his shoulder was a constant dull ache. But he was alive, they all were. Martha sat beside him, pressing a cold bottle against his forehead. "You're lucky you didn't puncture a lung," she said quietly. "Lucky's not the word I'd use," Kade muttered. Duncan gave a short laugh from across the room. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Kramer, I'll give you that." The radio crackled and a voice cut through the static human, rough and blessedly familiar. "Survivors of Marrow Creek, this is Captain Reeves of the United Colonial Resistance. Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound." Kade opened his eyes, a slow grin spreading across his bruised face. "They're coming for us," Martha said, almost in disbelief. Kade nodded, wincing as his ribs protested. "Guess we're not done yet," he said. Outside, the smoke began to thin. The ruined town lay behind them, a testament to a simple truth the Shalzek would never understand: humans didn't quit. They fought dirty. They fought broken. But they fought until there was nothing left to give, and then they fought some more. Kade leaned back against the wall, the battered transmitter still clutched in his hand. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a real breath. It hurt like hell. And it was glorious.